Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, the US President Donald Trump seems to be trying to do his bit to ease the trade war with China. Speaking earlier at the G7 summit in the French resort of Biarritz, the US President said the Chinese are now ready to talk. This is despite the White House saying on Sunday that Mr. Trump regrets not raising tariffs higher on Chinese imports. Both countries announced plans for new border taxes on each other's products on Friday, and overnight Asian markets fell while China's currency dropped to its lowest in more than 10 years.
Two calls, and very, very good calls, very productive calls. They mean business. They want to be able to make a deal. It's very important that, I think it's very important for them. Look, they've lost 3 million jobs and a lot of things have happened, and it's why President Xi's a great leader. He understands, and it's going to be great for China, it's going to be great for the U.S., it's going to be great for the world. He understands that, and he's able to do things that other people aren't able to do. So we were called, and we're going to start very shortly to negotiate. We'll see what happens, but I think we're going to make a deal because they don't want to lose their chains. They have supply chains that are unbelievably intricate, and people are all leaving, and they're going to other countries, including the United States. By the way, we're going to get a lot of them too, a percentage. Meaning, I think we're going to get a higher percentage than a lot of people would think. So we are going to start talking very seriously. We'll see how that goes. We've had a lot of good news. We had other good news yesterday, but I can't talk to you about that. And frankly, you people, you call that one totally wrong. You have that one figured as wrong as you can figure it. But we had some other good news yesterday.
Donald Trump. Well, for an international and African perspective on the US-China trade conflict, I'm joined now in the studio by Dr. Sharif Ghali Ibrahim, a lecturer in political science at the University of Abuja, who holds a PhD from the Huazhong University in central China and is a fellow of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, by Dr. Obadiah Mailafia, a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and by the London-based economist and international business analyst Christian Udechukwu. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I'll start with you, Christian, because we're hearing one thing from the White House and another from the US president. What should we expect? I mean, further confusing signals about just what the outlook is for this trade conflict?
I think you can, thank you, Charles, for having me on the program, but I think you can guess from Mr. Trump's remarks at the G7 closing press conference that he's looking to de-escalate the trade tensions. I think he was probably greatly irritated on Friday when China announced their $70 billion tariff, which focused essentially on the key states, the key battleground states that Mr. Trump expects to win for his re-election.
So he took it personally, did he?
So he took it personally, and he showed, he couldn't hide his anger, he couldn't hide his frustration, because definitely the figures that prove how much the trade tension has affected the American economy has not yet come true. And the fear that the economists have, if you were following the discussions going on in Jackson Hole, where the Federal Reserve chiefs were having their retreat, you will find that they still see very positive and very strong figures. They don't even see any rationale for cutting the rates and so on. And so by the time these figures of affecting the trade tensions begin to filter through, perhaps in the last quarter of 2019, or in the first quarter of 2020, it might be too late for the US president. Because the same reason that compelled him to change the start date for the last tariff that was to start on the 1st of September, the same reasons that corporate America pressured him to shift the date, or not to, which was really like a request for an outright cancellation, but it was moved forward to December. Those same reasons are the same things that are compelling him now to de-escalate, because if it doesn't, both Wall Street, the tech giants, the farmers that are losing trade with China and other economies are going to combine to force him out of office in 2020. And he doesn't want that.
Absolutely. Well, let me bring you in, Dr. Obadiah Mailathia. Of course, you're a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, so you're very much across monetary issues, financial markets, and so on. Is it very striking that in Asian markets they were focusing on all the negative stuff and the suggestion that the tension is going to ratchet up, if anything, whereas those comments from President Trump that China wanted to talk, which came out shortly before European markets opened, did underpin some sort of modest gains in several European markets?
Well, thank you, Charles. The Chinese are trying to keep a very balanced disposition about the whole thing. But there's no doubt that they are quite rattled. The financial markets have taken a hit. The yuan has seen a lot of its
That's
value.
the Chinese currency.
The Chinese currency. The yuan renminbi has seen some of its value really massively depreciated. The sad thing is that there's very little wisdom, even at the highest levels of world leadership, because if they read even a little bit of economic or financial history, they will know that nobody wins in trade wars. Everybody loses. I mean, some might lose more than others, but in the end, we are all losers in the whole thing.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, from World War I up before World War II, those trade wars led to what they call beggar thy neighbor policies, in which everybody in the end lost out in terms of collective welfare. And of course, the chickens are now coming home to roost. Trump realizes that there's a limit to the kind of braggadocio and the machismo that he brings to some of his economic, diplomacy or lack of it. And of course, nobody wins in this business, and everybody will suffer at the end of the day. So I'm happy that at last, some semblance of reasoning is returning. The Chinese, I must say, have been the more balanced of the two, because they didn't really want a trade war. But they have...
Yeah, but obviously everything is to their advantage, which is the argument the Americans are making. So why would they want a trade war in those circumstances?
But they have a very big chip that they are not playing yet.
What's that?
They own something like $1 trillion of American treasury bills. And the very day they say, look, we want our $1 trillion back, the dollar is going to go down. But of course, so will their own investment assets.
So as you said, nobody wins.
Nobody wins.
Right. Let me bring in Dr. Sharif Ghali Ibrahim. You have first-hand knowledge of the way the Chinese think. You've studied there. You got your PhD from there, and you're still a fellow of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. What are the chances that these tariffs, from a Chinese perspective, will now become relaxed? Because there's a short delay before the taxes come into force, this latest round of taxes. Is it possible that if they get talking very soon, a further escalation may not actually take place?
One basic thing that we must all understand, Charles, is that China has defined its position economically and politically right in its foreign policy position, which is peaceful coexistence and respect to the sovereignty and dignity of other states within the Committee of Nations.
Right.
So China, I think, it's been pushed to the wall because it never intended to actually engage in this trade war, just like my colleague here said.
Right.
But one thing that we must understand, what actually gravitated the United States under the watch of Donald Trump to wage this war, there is one major reason. And what's that reason? The American empire is declining, which many scholars, even the previous American President Jimmy Carter, said that the rise of China is inevitable. So therefore, Donald Trump has actually understood that. But on the other side, he had promised the Americans, as part of his campaign promises, to make America great again.
Right.
So Trump is afraid. Not the American empire declines under his watch. He has been looking for all ways and means to see that he frustrates this drastic rising economy, which is China. What do? Let us wage a trade war. Let us determine who pilots the global economy. Then the first thing is, let's impose tariff on these particular goods coming from China so that we can. But another thing is, Trump is very unpredictable. When he says he's ready to discuss with China, you cannot actually predict that tomorrow he's going to say or position himself in what he said today. And you can't imagine being an ally to the United States of America, you also become a victim of American trade war. Look at Canada, for example, even being a member of the G7. How Canada managed to get its tracks back with the United States of America, even the EU. So there is a kind of lack of peaceful compartmentalization of the G7. The EU is on its own. That is why Donald Tusk said that if the United States of America dares impose tariff on the French wine, then the EU will immediately respond. So they are just not in good terms with the EU, not in good terms even with Russia, even though Donald Trump, argued even at the G7 summit that Russia should be brought back in order to complement the G8. Then, on the other side, look at Iran, even though Zarif, the foreign minister, came. So I think the issue with China is ever ready to end this particular trade war. Because just like he said, it is not really important, for both of the parties, warring parties.
Right.
And when it continues, America will be hit worse and most.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought. We're going to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead. I'll be joined by my panel here of international business experts on China as we talk more about the latest twists in the US-China trade war. Stay with us. And with me in the studio here in Abuja, dissecting this latest twist in the US-China trade tussle, Dr. Sharif Ghali Ibrahim, a lecturer in political science at the University of Abuja, who holds a PhD from the Huazhong University in central China and is a fellow of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Obadiah Mailafia, a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and the London-based economist and international business analyst Christian Udechukwu. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And I'll come to you, Christian, because we just heard Laurie there talking about the fact that China is not part of the G7 and whether or not the G20 has diminished the import and relevance of the G7. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. Do you think the G7 remain the top table purely because they represent Western-oriented democracies, and to that extent it still carries a lot of purchase?
Well, I think you know that the G7 was more like a concept that evolved post-war, World War II, and was a general outcome of part of the institutions that were established post-World War for global stability, security, and economic development, and has remained largely that way. It has not been tinkered with to sort of recognize the new emergent economic powerhouses in the world. Really, like both you and Laurie were suggesting in your exchanges, it seems particularly strange that the US president is making an argument for Russia to be readmitted to be part of the G8, when actually the argument should perhaps be about the G9 that, that includes China and Russia. Because in the absence of these two superpowers, considering that India was present at the meeting, the absence of India and the absence of China and Russia actually makes hollow most of the discussions that have been taking place, considering how significant they are, both in terms of global security and global economic development. So yes, the G7 should be up for review, if you like. So
That's a good point.
There are more substantive decisions that can be made there that can actually hold its own. The absence of both countries, it's a bit like the absence of Nigeria in the discussions between the G7 and the African countries. The absence of Nigeria, again, takes a large chunk away from the substance of the discussions that ought to be held. Nigeria is arguably the largest economy in Africa, the biggest player, the most populous. And in terms of infrastructure that will support the free trade agreement that is evolving, Nigeria is a significant player, both in terms of the currency evolving in West Africa and whatever will underpin the Africa Free Trade Area. It can't happen without Nigeria. So it seems a bit crude and odd that, you have a G7 meeting with African leaders and Nigeria is absent at the table. I mean, what's that mean?
Is it a sort of colonialist mentality, to use a cliche there?
I wouldn't say that. I just think that, and if you look at the outcome, it's a bit odd. Because if you look again at the outcome of the G7 meeting with African leaders, you'll see that there was some real substantive...
Right. What about 5 seconds?
Missing. Well, because, you see the African Development Bank coming to the table, asking for a $42 billion gap in economic financing for enterprise development, putting down $1 billion itself on the table, and then getting away with $251 million from the G7.
We're going to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the global implications of the trade war between the US and China. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, as we mentioned earlier, President Trump says he's willing to make a deal with China. He was speaking at the G7 summit in the French resort of Biarritz, and it comes as shares fell across the Asia-Pacific region over US-China trade relations. Within the last few days, Donald Trump has further increased tariffs on Chinese goods. Mr. Trump announced $250 billion in Chinese goods, currently attracting 25% tariffs, would now be taxed at 30% from the 1st of October. Earlier, China imposed additional tariffs on US imports worth $75 billion. Well, with me in the studio dissecting this latest twist in the US-China trade tussle, Dr. Sharif Ghali Ibrahim, a lecturer in political science at the University of Abuja, who holds a PhD from the Huazhong University in central China and is a fellow of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Obadiah Mailafia, a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and the London-based economist and international business analyst Christian Udechukwu, to be absolutely clear. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And I'll come to you, Dr. Mailafia, because we were talking earlier about the significance of the G7 without China being there. Is it probably worth keeping in mind that the G7 probably still has, talking about its relevance, the best bet at containing some of the more unusual policies of the current American administration, to put it diplomatically? So while we look at the G20 to drive economic governance on the big thorny issues, it's the G7, the US's closest allies, who probably are best able to push back or stop things from getting worse in the world right now.
Yes, Charles, we would like to think so. I think that the G7 is still very much relevant, and they control something like 58% of the total global GDP, over 40% of global trade, so they still wield enormous influence. And we hope that they would at least be able to be a restraining influence on the American president, whom in the past had often behaved like a bull in a china shop. And at one of the NATO meetings, he actually grabbed Macron's hands and shook him so hard that he pulled him, and the guy nearly stumbled and fell. At another meeting, he simply ignored his neighbor, Trudeau, the young Trudeau, his Prime Minister of Canada, simply ignored him, which was quite embarrassing. But let's look at it carefully. The G7 started from around 1971 when President Richard Nixon decided to suspend the dollar in relation to gold parity. So from that moment, we entered the age of floating exchange rates. So there was a kind of a small group inspired by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was president of France at that time, and a few, and Germany, I think Brandt, one of those German chancellors, and a few others used to meet in the White House library and discuss at foreign ministerial level. From there, by 1973, when the OPEC crisis started with the quintupling of global oil prices, it became a major crisis for the advancing economies, and they now decided to consolidate G7 as a group. So they are still very important, but it is very odd, like my colleagues have said, that they would not include China in this group when China is in fact number 2.
Absolutely.
Some people are already
it doesn't make sense at all.
Some people are already saying that in fact in purchasing power parity terms, China is already ahead of the United States. But my friend Sharif here, Dr. Sharif will agree with me that even the Chinese, they're too embarrassed to hear that they're number 1. They prefer not to. You see, the Chinese state has existed for over 1,000 years. They are very smart people. They prefer not to shout. They prefer to let their actions
So in terms of the evolution of countries, you could say that they're middle-aged or older, whereas America remains a teenager in terms of world history.
And unfortunately often behave sometimes like a
Absolutely.
Like a teenager.
Well, let me bring you in, Dr. Sharif, there. This trade war, I mean, let's get away from the G7, G8, whether China should be a part of it, and talk about the ongoing trade war with the US. It's being seen by financial markets and economists as probably the biggest single threat to the global outlook. And that's because anything that makes it more difficult for countries and businesses to trade across borders is likely to raise their costs and makes it much more likely that they'll decide not to go ahead with an investment. So there is the prospect of this leading to weaker economic growth. Is there not perhaps even a global recession?
Yeah, of course, because recently economists as well as observers around the world, and especially in the United States, they predicted a kind of a recession that the United States will actually experience sooner or later. And there is this particular maxim that whenever the United States sneezes, the whole world catches cold. But there is one major issue that I want us to understand, because if you fail to understand this, you not understand nothing, as it relates to this particular trade war. The Europe, that is the European Union, as well as the United States of America, have been allies, you know, historically. This is a historical fact. And the United States of America claimed that it's been able to triumph over the Soviet Union during the Cold War because it was able to dominate Eurasia. So when you are able to dominate Central Europe, Eastern Europe, as well as Asia, definitely you have the world, you know, in your hands. And that is what Mohan and Moha argued. The Europeans also believe that without America, because the major threat to global domination those days was actually Russia and Germany. The whole Europeans were actually afraid of the dominant position of Germany. So that without the United States of America, the whole of Europe could not actually challenge Russia and Germany. Then without Europe, the United States of America will actually become an island off the shores of Eurasia. So now the argument is that United States of America want to maintain that particular position, and that is why it is making sure that it cripples all economies, all rising economies and rising powers in all regions, from Asia to Persian Gulf and other parts of the world. Then the Europeans have also understood that United States of America is withering gradually.
Right.
And that is why Macron, being the host of this particular G7, he wants to emerge as a significant player within the EU, because the major player, which is Britain, is actually going. And apparently, we are seeing a gradual chemistry or economic romance between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, because Donald Trump had already given his support to Boris Johnson even prior to the conduct of the elections. So definitely, he has also been supporting Brexit. So when Britain exits the EU, we're going to see more political and economic alliance with the United States of America, whereby the EU now will be an opponent to United States of America. But on the other hand, the EU want to create more market, and it also want to romance with China and open more markets in Africa. So therefore, China has a greater opportunity.
Okay.
Why?
Very, very briefly, because I've got to bring him in. We're almost out of time.
All right. Because China does not antagonize, enemies' friends.
Right, okay. Let me bring in, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I've got to bring in Christian Udechukwu. You're going to have the last word, because we heard quite a bit of opposition from different heads of state at that G7 summit, including, he talked about Boris Johnson saying he doesn't want trade war, he wants trade peace. Does it seem as if President Trump is particularly susceptible to G7 leaders? I mean, he's consistently come across as being willing to go his own way, and you've got about 20 seconds.
Well, I think that more than anything else, you're correct in the sense that perhaps the US president came under pressure at the G7, where they tried to present to him a balanced picture of the collateral damage that is emerging from his trade war with China and the trade tensions he's creating globally. So that message has got through to him. But most importantly is that the US markets and the US corporates that are under pressure from the trade wars are bringing the message home to him.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to leave it there. Chris Udechukwu, the London-based economist and international business analyst, Dr. Obadiah Malafia, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, and Dr. Sharif Ghali, lecturer in political science at the University of Abuja. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of The Arise Interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.